Recorded webinar on civil rights requirements in the Summer Food Service Program, or SFSP. This training is designed to provide new and existing SFSP sponsors with detailed information on their responsibility to assure that the benefits of the SFSP are made available to all eligible participants in a non-discriminatory manner, and the supporting documentation that must be maintained to support these efforts. Throughout this presentation, I will refer to your responsibility to your participants, which would generally be the children accessing your SFSP meal service sites. However, please note that because of the nature of our programs, participants often have a parent or guardian acting on their behalf, and for the purposes of this presentation, when I refer to participants, I mean both the actual children or youth accessing your meal service sites and any person legally acting on their behalf. This presentation is most appropriate for administrative staff involved in policy development and implementation of policies as they relate to the SFSP. The overall goal when we talk about civil rights within the federally funded child nutrition programs, including the Summer Food Service Program, is to ensure equal treatment and access for all current and prospective participants. To ensure that this is happening, we need to make all prospective participants aware of their rights. We need to eliminate any barriers, real or perceived, that might prevent participation, and we need to ensure that we are treating people overall with dignity and respect. Throughout this presentation, we will review the ways to achieve these goals through civil rights compliance. Regulations surrounding civil rights in the USDA-funded programs cover all of the federally funded child nutrition programs, from the National School Lunch Program, School Breakfast Program, and Special Milk Programs, to the Summer Food Service Program, the Food Distribution Program, and the Child and Adult Care Food Program. Any sponsor who receives federal funding is required to adhere to civil rights regulations and guidelines in order to be eligible to participate in the program. It's important to note that if your organization participates in a federally funded program, any amount of federal dollars that come into one part of your organization open up the entire organization to the responsibility of ensuring civil rights in terms of equal access and treatment of participants in your overall programming. When we talk about civil rights, we are referring specifically to the treatment of the protected classes as listed on this slide. The federally protected civil classes are race, color, national origin, sex, age, and disability. In addition to those listed classes, the Rhode Island Department of Education includes sexual orientation and gender identity and expression as a protected class as well. As I mentioned, any sponsor who participates in a federally funded program is required to adhere to civil rights regulations, and as an extension of that, any parties who enter into contracts where federal funds will be exchanged are required to have assurances that all parties involved will also comply with civil rights regulations. So this means that the agreement between RIDE and our SFSP sponsors needs to include that assurance, which it does, and then any additional agreements between the sponsor and contracted vendors, like a food service management company or other food vendor, also need to contain these assurances. Really, anyone who is involved with the overall flow of the federal funds needs to commit to adhering to civil rights regulations. So the very first part of ensuring that a successful program is correctly implementing civil rights guidelines is to make sure that staff are well trained. Training starts from the top down. So it starts with our partners at the USDA who provide training to the state agency. And then we at the state agency provide training to you, our local sponsors, who will then be responsible for going out and training your frontline staff who are actually responsible for the operational aspect of your program on a daily basis. Per federal guidance, there are 9 areas at a minimum for which each sponsor is responsible for receiving and providing training on in terms of civil rights. And these are the topics that we will cover throughout this presentation, which are collection and use of data, effective public notification systems, complaint procedures, conflict resolution, compliance reviews, resolution of non-compliance, requirements for reasonable modifications for persons with disabilities, requirements for language assistance, and customer service. The first topic area that we will review is collection and use of data. It's a requirement of the SFSP that each participating sponsor collect racial and ethnic data on its participants at least once during program operations for every site that is serving meals. For closed enrolled sites that are collecting meal benefit applications to establish eligibility, the meal benefit application does include a section where participants can self-identify. However, many participants will choose either not to self-identify or not to return a meal benefit application, at all. So while this is considered to be the most accurate way to gather racial and ethnic data, it is not always the most practical way. In the SFSP, racial and ethnic data are generally collected via the annual beneficiary data form, which asks sponsors to use visual identification during meal service to classify participants into the appropriate ethnic and racial categories. This information must be collected and maintained for a minimum of 3 years plus the current year and must be accessible to the state agency or the USDA upon request. Sponsors are responsible for maintaining racial and ethnic data, but it does not get submitted to the Child Nutrition Department at RIDE or up to the USDA. However, it's still important because this information shows at the site level how well your program is reaching each of the different populations within your community, and RIDE or the USDA may request racial or ethnic data information from a sponsor to help establish the validity of a civil rights complaint. So if a participant were to indicate that they thought that they were being discriminated on based on their race, and your racial and ethnic data either wasn't available or indicated that there was a very low level of participation in your program from that racial group, well, that might help sustain that complaint. On a local level, this information can be used for your purposes as a sponsor to help identify any needs in terms of additional resources that participants might need to help them access your program, including translated materials and etc. Racial and ethnic data are captured separately, and we will generally start by classifying participants into one of the two ethnic categories. Hispanic or Latino is the first category, and the second is not Hispanic or Latino. Every participant will fall into one of these two categories. So, if you have 100 participants, you should have 100 people listed in total as either Hispanic or Latino or not Hispanic or Latino. The next step would be to collect racial data. In addition to falling into one of the two ethnic categories, every person will fall into at least one of the racial categories listed on the screen, which are American Indian or Alaskan Native, Asian, Black or African American, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, and white. Some participants will identify as more than one of these racial categories, but each participant must be identified in at least one of these categories. So again, if you have 100 participants, you would have 100 people total listed in your ethnicity section and 100 or more in the racial section. A sample of a completed beneficiary data form with both ethnic and racial classifications can be seen on the next slide. Here is an example of the beneficiary data form that we discussed in the previous slide. As you can see, this site had 100 participants on the day that this form was completed, and all 100 participants were classified into one of the two ethnic categories. From there, all participants were classified in one or more racial categories. In this case, some participants were identified in more than one racial category, so the total number of participants in the racial category is greater than the number listed in the ethnic categories. Once complete, this form must be signed, dated, and maintained on file with your other program documentation for a minimum of 3 years plus the current year. The second topic that we will review is effective public notification systems. An effective public notification system will include these three main components: a description of program availability, a description of complaint information, and the full USDA non-discrimination statement, which actually will include the procedures for filing a complaint as well. There are certain methods of communication that are required for sponsors as part of their participation in the Summer Food Service Program. The first is a public media release. All SFSP sponsors must use the RIDE-provided template to issue a media release annually, and a copy of this release must be submitted to RIDE at the time of program application. The second requirement is the posting of the And Justice for All poster. This poster must be current and must be placed in a conspicuous area that is customer-facing, meaning that people that are participating in your program are able to see and read the information presented on the poster. There are other methods of communication that are optional that you might elect to use when advertising your program, such as flyers, brochures, radio ads, and other methods of marketing. These are all great ways to communicate and make sure that you are reaching the entire population of prospective participants. Through our statewide expansion and outreach campaign, RIDE produces many of these types of advertisements on behalf of our sponsors, but any sponsor choosing to produce their own additional advertisement materials must be sure to use the most current version of the USDA non-discrimination statement. If any agency advertisements or communications include vital program information, which we'll talk about later in this presentation, then the full USDA non-discrimination statement must be included in the communication, or you must have received approval to use the shortened non-discrimination tagline. But either way, your program materials must include a statement of non-discrimination. In the SFSP, we refer to the public release as a media release, and this is a required part of the initial application to participate in the program, as I mentioned. In order to be compliant with federal requirements, a public release must include the information as shown on this slide: program eligibility requirements, what benefits and services are offered, like the availability of free breakfast, lunch, and/or snack, depending on your operation, how and when the program is available, the rights and responsibility of your participants, the procedures for filing a complaint, the non-discrimination statement, and then any kind of programmatic changes. So for instance, if you normally offer breakfast and lunch, but you've stopped serving breakfast under the program, you want to make sure that people are made aware of this to minimize the potential for complaints if a participant is not able to receive the services that they thought were available. This may mean that you're required to release more than one public release throughout the course of your program. It's also important to note that while the non-discrimination statement does include general procedures for filing a complaint with the USDA, your release should also include any local complaint procedures, which we'll discuss in more detail further in this presentation. The Injustice for All poster is something that each of you should be familiar with, though it is occasionally updated and may look different from what is pictured on the screen than previous versions that you are aware of. All sites that participate in a federally funded child nutrition program must display this poster, and it must be posted somewhere that participants can easily access and read it. Posters are only acceptable in the 11:17 format, and you can obtain copies of the poster from RIDE. You should not be making any local reproductions of this poster. Also, as I mentioned, these posters are updated periodically, and your site is responsible for displaying the most current version, which, as of the date of this recording in 2020, should match what is pictured on the screen. If you have an outdated version, which will likely be in red, white, and blue, and/or will include a picture of the Statue of Liberty, you should remove this version and contact RIDE for a copy of the most current poster. Now we will move on to discuss the use of the USDA non-discrimination statement. Early in this presentation, I mentioned the term vital program documents. Vital documents are any documents that include information regarding the availability of program benefits. So for instance, mentioning the availability of free meals upon enrollment would be notification of program benefits. For the purposes of the Summer Food Service Program, which is primarily utilized to operate open sites that don't require any kind of enrollment paperwork, you may have very few, if any, documents that are considered to be vital. If your organization uses a website to advertise your programming, the website should include information on the availability of meals through the SFSP, and therefore would be required to include the full non-discrimination statement, either on the primary page that discusses the food program, or through a hyperlink to the statement. If you use a hyperlink, the hyperlink cannot be linked to a closed document, meaning PDF or Word format file. It would have to bring you directly to a web page with the non-discrimination statement. When using the non-discrimination statement, you need to make sure that the statement is no smaller than the smallest font in whatever document you are producing, and also that you haven't changed the wording or structure of the statement. I will show you what the full statement looks like on the next slide, and you want to maintain that top to bottom structure as you'll see on the slide. There are some situations in which your program documents will not require the full non-discrimination statement and could receive permission to use the shortened tag, which states this institution is an equal opportunity provider. Currently, the only approved blanket use of that statement in Rhode Island is for program menus. But there are other situations in which you might just be saying, we offer nutritious meals as part of our regular programming, or something to that effect, and that's not necessarily a vital piece of information about the program, since it doesn't speak at all to accessibility, benefits, or eligibility requirements, or other vital information. So if you have materials that include that kind of generic statement, but do still reference the program, they may qualify for use of the shortened tag. Anything that you have questions on, you'll need to get approval through the RIDE office, and we actually have to send it up to the line for approval from the USDA office to make sure that use of the shortened tag is appropriate. When in doubt, or if you have not received approval, you will need to use the full statement. This is the full USDA non-discrimination statement. Please be reminded that this statement is updated periodically by the USDA, though the current version will likely look very similar to past versions. As of the date of this recording in 2020, the version shown on the screen represents the most recent update, which occurred in 2015. Something that we commonly see is that sponsors will carry forward program documents, including the non-discrimination statement, on things like flyers from prior years, and that the non-discrimination statement will end up being an outdated version that has just been carried forward year over year. So please be sure to check all of your materials to make sure that if you are using a RIDE template that you have the most current version, which should include the updated non-discrimination statement if required, or that your local materials that include the non-discrimination statement have been updated to include the most current version. Again, even when updated, this statement will look very similar to previous versions, and it can be difficult to tell if you are using the most current version. So best practice would be to ensure that each year when RIDE releases new template documents that you discard any older versions that you have printed, or that you copy and paste the non-discrimination statement directly from a RIDE template into your local documents if necessary. One other area to consider as we talk about non-discrimination is to use images that reflect diversity when you're using imagery to communicate about your food program. An example of that can be seen on the screen. The next area that we'll cover is complaint procedures. Each sponsor of the Summer Food Service Program is encouraged to develop and implement a written procedure to handle discrimination complaints. Occasionally, sponsors will have existing policies in place that speak to civil rights expectations for the overall organization, but not necessarily as it pertains to the food program. The requirements that we are going to discuss will pertain specifically to the SFSP. So if a sponsor has an existing civil rights policy that they could choose to compare these requirements to the existing policy and update as necessary to ensure that these minimum requirements are being met. Or a sponsor could develop a separate civil rights policy that is specific to the SFSP. A civil rights complaint is a complaint that alleges discrimination based on one of those protected classes that we discussed earlier. Discrimination can occur when a participant is delayed benefits, denied benefits, treated differently, or given disparate treatment. There are multiple ways that a participant can file a complaint of discrimination. They can go directly to you as the sponsor, they can come to RIDE directly, or they can actually go directly to the USDA with that information provided in the non-discrimination statement. We would encourage that sponsors work with participants to resolve complaints at the lowest level, but regardless of the outcome of a discussion that you have with a participant of a potential civil rights complaint, it is your responsibility as a sponsor to ensure that each participant understands their right to file a complaint, even as you are working towards resolution. So when you are having these conversations, if someone were to call you and say that they felt they had been treated in a discriminatory manner, you should by all means work to get as much information as possible to resolve the complaint at the lowest level possible. But you need to make sure that the participant that you are speaking to fully understands their right to lodge a formal complaint, and that the end result of the conversation is that you and the participant both know what the intent is. Because if after speaking with you and getting clarification, the participant elects not to lodge a formal complaint, that's fine. But if they did want to move forward in the complaint process, you must then record that complaint and then also forward it to RIDE. So it's important that at the end of that conversation, both parties understand the intent so there's no miscommunication about whether or not a formal complaint should have been filed. Any person who is alleging discrimination based on one of the protected classes that we have discussed has a right to file a complaint within 180 days of the alleged discriminatory action. And this timeline can actually be extended for legitimate reasons as determined by the USDA. Complaints can be filed verbally. They do not need to be formally written. If that happens and you receive a complaint over the phone, it is the responsibility of the sponsor to document the complaint and then forward it to our office. By acknowledging and documenting a complaint, the sponsor is effectively accepting the complaint. Every effort should be made to have the complainant provide contact information, the specific location and/or organization delivering the service that the complaint is in reference to, the nature of the incident or action that led to the complaint, the basis on which the complainant believes discrimination exists, based on one of those protected classes, contact information for any other person who may have knowledge of the alleged discriminatory action, and the dates during which the alleged actions occurred. If you are unable to get all of this information, you will still need to record and accept the complaint, but you should try to get as much information as possible to help with the complaint resolution process. Once it has been accepted and recorded, that's when you would forward it to our office here at RIDE. So you will need to have developed a complaint form or access the USDA complaint form in order to formally record a complaint. Once recorded, You will enter any complaints into your complaint log and refer the complaint to whoever is your designated civil rights contact person within your organization. And then you will report the complaint to RIDE within 5 working days of receipt. Remember, these complaints can not only be filed verbally, but they can also be anonymous. So if a person elects not to share their name, they can do that, but you should still record and forward the complaint with as much detail as you are able to get. In terms of documentation, you are encouraged to maintain a civil rights file that will contain both your procedures for filing a civil rights complaint as well as copies of your civil rights complaint form. You should also maintain a contact list that indicates who within your organization should be contacted if a civil rights complaint is received, which would be maintained in this file as well. Separately, you will also need to maintain a civil rights complaint log. It's really important to maintain the confidentiality of these logs to prevent the accusation of reprisal for filing a civil rights complaint. So, any completed civil rights complaint forms and the complaint log should be filed separately from other civil rights files, which should be accessible to anyone who might need to access a civil rights complaint form or your civil rights complaint procedures. And they should also be stored separately from any other operational complaints that are not related to civil rights that your organization might receive. Access to this log should be restricted and should generally be accessed only by your organization's designated civil rights point of contact. These logs must be dated and must be maintained for 3 years plus the current year, even if no complaints have been received. The next topic that we'll cover is conflict resolution. We find that many civil rights complaints actually arise from a misunderstanding, misinformation, or in some cases, poor customer service. It is often the reaction of sponsors to become nervous when civil rights issues are brought up, and they may elect not to engage with participants once the word discrimination is used. But it's really important that you get as much information as possible from your participants, and also that you try to determine the root of the problem to see if there is a resolution that can be worked towards. In many cases, if a participant feels heard and is able to clarify what the issue is, resolution can happen before a formal complaint is lodged. Staff should be trained to remain calm and ask about the situation while repeating back the complaint to make sure that they understand the situation. From there, they can try to help those involved work out their differences and may be able to resolve the issue before it goes any further. Just note that though we do encourage resolution at the lowest level and that you work with your participants, you should in no way discourage an individual from filing a complaint, and you must make them aware of their right to file a complaint. Now that you have each of these civil rights requirements in place that we've discussed already, the media release, general program communications, use of the non-discrimination statement, complaint procedures, and conflict resolution, you want to make sure that you are checking compliance. So compliance during meal service, as far as civil rights are concerned, means that there's no separation based on any of those protected classes during meal times, seating arrangements, serving lines, or eating areas. We recognize that there are some situations where a sponsor might separate participants specifically at mealtime for safety, such as the use of an allergy-free table. These situations should be used on a limited basis, shouldn't exclude participants from the overall eating environment, and they shouldn't be used for any purpose other than maintaining safety. The safety of your participants obviously needs to be your primary concern at all times, and if the use of a segregated table is the best way to maintain that, then that's the way that it will need to be. But you need to make sure that the table isn't used for anything else like disciplinary purposes, because that would be changing your participants' treatment as far as the food program is concerned. Other areas of compliance include making translations of program materials available, displaying the Injustice for All poster, using the correct version of the non-discrimination statement on your program materials, correctly determining meal benefit applications and making sure that meal benefit applications aren't denied incorrectly, or if they are, that those denied applications aren't disproportionately comprised of minority populations, if applicable, and that disabled participants are offered the same program benefits as all of your other participants. These are all items that should be reviewed in some way as either part of a formal monitoring visit or even just informally as you observe the daily operations of your program. It's important to make sure that compliance isn't just happening on paper through your civil rights policies and procedures, but that it's actually happening in practice by the people actually implementing your program on a daily basis. The next topic is resolution of non-compliance. If you were to go out and conduct a monitoring visit for one of your sites, or if RIDE staff were to come out and conduct a program review and we note non-compliance in one of the areas of civil rights that we just mentioned, you'd be required to submit a detailed plan of corrective action for each finding, and you would be expected to make those corrections immediately. Any failure to correct issues related to civil rights could result in termination from the program. The next section will review the requirement to make reasonable modifications for persons with disabilities. This is definitely a growing topic among youth, especially, and we continually receive updated guidance on this topic, so we'll spend a little bit of time on this. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see the regulations that govern the SFSP, as well as additional federal regulations that speak specifically to the treatment of persons with a disability. These regulations also define what the term disability means in the context of our programs, as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide. A disability, as is defined for the SFSP, would be a person who has a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more of the major life activities. In 2008, the Americans with Disability Act was amended and expanded the definition of major life activities to include major bodily functions, such as your immune system, your digestive system, your neurological system, and your circulatory system. So what this means is that many ailments that were not previously considered to be disabilities in the SFSP would likely fall under this new definition. For instance, participants with food allergies that are not life-threatening previously did not fall under the definition of a disability because it would not have impacted what was previously defined as a major life function. But now, with the expanded definition, which includes digestive functions, something like lactose intolerance could now fall under the category of a disability. Because of this, SFSP sponsors are now required to make more meal modifications than would have been required under the previous definition. Effective modifications will provide equal opportunity for program participants and generally will include, where possible, substituting menu items with something that is nutritionally equivalent. For example, if you have a participant with a dairy allergy and therefore need to substitute cheese from the menu item cheese pizza, you should be trying to replace that component with another meat alternate or another source of protein. It would not be appropriate to simply take the cheese off the pizza and only offer the grain, or to not offer the pizza at all. Those solutions would not really be substitutes and are definitely not nutritionally equivalent, so you would not be providing your participant with equal access to the benefits of your program. Instead, the sponsor may choose to offer a turkey sandwich in place of the pizza. In this case, the participant would not be receiving the same exact meal, but would still be receiving the intended nutritional benefits of the program, and so this would be an appropriate modification. Determining what may or may not be a disability can be tricky, and really it shouldn't be up to you. USDA guidance takes the onus off of the individual participant for defining and proving a disability and focuses more on what you as a sponsor can do to make a reasonable modification. So you should not be attempting to determine whether any specific ailment qualifies as a disability, but should instead be focusing your efforts on accommodating and making modifications for the identified ailment. If there is an additional cost, the cost associated with making a particular modification cannot be charged to your participants. There might be some situations where participants will elect to contribute either a substitute component or in some cases financial assistance, and they can choose to do that, but they cannot be required to do so. Sponsors should consider and include provisions for meeting special dietary needs in their contracts with food service vendors and caterers, if applicable. Modifications are not required to be an exact substitute listed on a note by a physician. So if, for instance, if a physician were to say that Johnny cannot have cow's milk due to digestive issues, please substitute silk almond milk, it's not the sponsor's responsibility to necessarily provide specifically silk almond milk, but rather to provide an adequate substitute, which might be a different brand of almond milk, or might be another dairy alternative like soy milk or rice milk. What's important is that you get clarification to understand why the modification is required. That way you know if what you are providing as a substitute is adequate to ensure the safety of your participant. Even if you are in disagreement with a participant, so thinking about that example we just discussed, if the sponsor was not in a position to provide that specific brand name, but instead provides a substitute that meets the participant's needs, but the participant is unhappy with the modification, sponsor still needs to make that modification as they work towards resolution with the participant. So just because you might be in disagreement on the best course of action, unless what you are doing could be harming the participant, don't stop making the modification. You still need to ensure equitable access as you work towards resolution. Because of the nature of the SFSP, which typically serves meals to any participant without enrollment documentation, making reasonable modifications for persons with disabilities can pose additional challenges. Sponsors often serve meals in locations with no readily available substitutes on hand and also likely do not know which participants might attend a meal service on any given day. Regardless of these factors, it is still the sponsor's responsibility to make reasonable modifications, and so these challenges should be taken into consideration when developing a plan for handling common food allergies. Are there common substitute items or meals that can be easily maintained on site just in case? If you have a participant that regularly attends meal service, is your staff empowered to collect additional information so that you can follow up and obtain a doctor's note? Unfortunately, there will be no perfect answer to making a meal modification that can apply to any situation, but sponsors must do their best to provide equal access to program benefits for all participants. Substitutions made for participants with disabilities are allowable in reimbursable meals, even if those meals are outside of the USDA meal pattern, as long as the modification is supported by a medical statement signed by a licensed physician. And in some cases, as I mentioned earlier, participants may choose to provide one or more components themselves as part of a modification plan, and those meals can still be reimbursable as long as an agreement has been made between the participant and the sponsor as the best way to move forward in making the required modification, and as long as it is clear to the participant that they are not required to provide their own modification. So again, looking back to that example that we just discussed in the previous slide, if the participant's family decided that they wanted to provide their own almond milk just to be sure that the participant is receiving the preferred brand, they would want, but they want the participant to receive all other meal components as provided by the sponsor, then you can allow that. You just need to make it clear that the sponsor is willing and able to make a modification, and it is not required of the parent to do so on their own. If, in that situation, the participant still chooses to provide their own modification, then it is allowable and the meal would still be considered to be reimbursable, so long as you maintain documentation of your discussions with the family. When accepting a medical statement from a participant to support a modification plan, the statement must include the food that needs to be avoided and a brief explanation of how the exposure will affect your participant. In the case of a food allergy, simply identifying that a participant may not have a specific food due to allergy reasons would be sufficient, though you may elect to request more information to ensure that you know the signs of a potential reaction and are prepared to act accordingly. Medical statements may also include recommended substitutes, but this is not a requirement, and a sponsor may choose not to make the exact substitute requested if an alternate option still meets the participant's needs, as discussed in the previous slide. A medical statement needs to provide sufficient detail for you to make a safe modification, but it shouldn't provide specific diagnosis information, nor should you request that information. It would be a HIPAA violation for that information to be provided to unnecessary parties, and in this case, it's really not important what the specific ailment is, just the item to be avoided, and why, so we understand the full repercussions and what we can do to replace it. It is acceptable to seek clarification from a physician, although, again, you should still be working to make a modification as you are seeking clarification, and you don't want to delve into anything too specific in terms of a diagnosis. As I mentioned in the previous slide, meal service in the SFSP can pose additional challenges to meeting these requirements. Sponsors should train frontline staff to be prepared for potential modification requests and to document any conversations had and/or modifications made. If a participant attends an SFSP site for the first time and requests a meal modification at that time, it is not likely that the sponsor would be able to obtain a doctor's note for that particular modification if it falls outside of the meal pattern. The best case scenario would be to put a plan in place that allows for modifications that still fall within the meal pattern. If this is not possible, then the sponsor should document the request, the modification that was ultimately made, and the information that was provided to the participant in case they choose to participate in future meal service. There may be some instances in which you receive meal modification requests that are not related to a disability. An example of that would be a modification request related to a lifestyle or religious preference. This would include things like requests for vegetarian meals or meals to meet other special diet requests like low carb, but these are not supported by a medical statement. Sponsors are encouraged but not required to make food substitutions for this type of request. If a sponsor elects to make a substitution based on a lifestyle or religious preference, then those substitutions must fall within the USDA meal patterns in order for the meal to be considered reimbursable. So generally, this would be managed by simply offering alternate food selections within a specific meal component. For instance, if you have a vegetarian population, you may offer a variety of meat alternate options that would be appropriate for vegetarians and non-vegetarians. So each participant is still receiving the meat alternate component as required by the meal pattern. They are simply receiving different food items within that component category. It is important to note that, as I mentioned before, with this expanded definition of disability, many things that may not have identified to a sponsor before, may have been identified to a sponsor before that did not fall under this category of a disability, may now be considered to be a disability and would require modification on request. So it's really important to communicate with participants about the process for requesting a meal modification, and then also to communicate internally with your staff, which we'll review a little bit more on the next slide. Procedurally, a sponsor needs to develop a procedure for requesting meal modifications. All staff who will be involved need to be trained on this procedure, and if an organization employs 15 or more people, there needs to be a 504 coordinator appointed to handle civil rights issues, including the coordination of meal modification requests. So a sponsor may consider assembling a team for implementation, which might include the 504 coordinator, a nurse, a food service professional, or anyone else in your organization that might be involved in this process. You want to make sure that you are communicating clearly about these procedures with your participants. Again, this is about ensuring that there are no actual or perceived barriers to participation in your program. If a participant is suffering from a severe allergy and does not think that a sponsor can accommodate it or does not know how to go about requesting a modification, this could be considered a barrier to participation in your program. So you need to make sure that you've communicated that there is a process for requesting modifications. You need to communicate the decision regarding the modification request, and you also need to include procedures for appealing a decision that is made based on a modification request. Participants need to be given the opportunity to examine records that are related to the decision regarding the modification request, and they should be given the right to file a grievance. There should be steps in place to provide for an impartial hearing, and there should also be a review process for appeals. And again, if you are sending out these communications that include hearing notices or rights to appeal, you'll need to include the full USDA non-discrimination statement on those communications. We would highly recommend that sponsors post information on how to make a meal modification request on any public website, and that you should refer to both your internal complaint procedures as well as the federal complaint procedures when providing any information about a participant's rights. So if your modification procedures include adverse notice of modification requests for a modification that cannot be made, which would be rare, but if that's the case, you would list both the sponsor's 504 coordinator as an appeal option and also the USDA intake office for civil rights complaints. Another best practice outside of developing this policy and including it as part of your regular communications would be working with your food service provider to develop a kind of game plan for accommodating the 8 most common allergens, which you'll see on this slide. It's important to note that while it's great to have a blueprint and a starting point, each individual modification request needs to be treated separately, and you must avoid imposing your own personal biases and experiences on any other person's modification request. If you have a participant that is allergic to soy, for example, they may not need the exact same modification as a different participant that is allergic to soy, and you yourself might be allergic to soy, but you might experience it differently than your participant and might require different modifications. So while you may have a basic blueprint of how you would generally plan to accommodate this kind of request, you would want to follow that up to let participants know that while you have a general plan for meal modifications for participants with an allergy to soy, you will work to understand how this plan may or may not fit in with that participant's specific needs, and you would start the conversation from there. The next required topic is language assistance. Any recipient of federal funds has a responsibility to ensure meaningful access for all participants with limited English proficiency. Limited English proficiency, or LEP, is defined as individuals who do not speak English as their primary language and have limited ability to read, speak, write, or understand English. So this would not only include the population of participants that might speak a different language, but it could also include hearing impaired or not fully literate participants. This is all about ensuring that you have the resources in place to provide access to each of your potential participants, and that is going to include providing translated materials and interpreters as necessary to make sure that all of your participants have access to program benefits and are aware of their rights. In some cases, sponsors may elect to use volunteers as interpreters to assist, which is acceptable, but it's very important that volunteers understand the ethics requirements of an interpreter, including confidentiality. Our programs deal with confidential income and other information, and it's important that not only do your participants understand their right to confidentiality, but that interpreters understand that as well. So these kinds of services need to be able to be provided at a local level in a way that is consistent and competent. That means that it shouldn't be standard practice for somebody in the office who speaks a little bit of Spanish to get on the phone and attempt to act as a translator for program participants. That's not providing services in a competent way. It also means that services shouldn't be dependent on the scheduling of a part-time employee. So if you use a specific employee as translator, but they are only available a few days a week or every other week, that's not going to be a consistent way to provide services to your participant, and it's unacceptable to delay benefits just because you don't have the resources available at any given time. In some cases, a participant may elect to bring their own interpreter, which is acceptable as long as the confidentiality has been addressed and as long as the participant understands that it is not their responsibility. Just as with meal modifications, they are not required to provide their own services, but they may choose to. In this case, the arrangement needs to be acceptable not only to the participant, but also to the sponsor. It would not be acceptable for a participant to bring a translator and for that translator to speak solely on behalf of the participant seeking services, meaning that you don't see them conferring in their language at all. That would not be indicative of the program participant actually participating and understanding their rights. So you would want to make sure that both parties are comfortable because ultimately, the sponsor is responsible for ensuring that each participant is aware of their rights, and if you are in a situation where you see an interpreter who is not conferring with the participant, they may not be adequately relaying the rights of the participant to them, and that could come back as a civil rights complaint down the line. Lastly, children should not really be used as interpreters for all of the reasons described above, for confidentiality, for competency of services, and for ensuring that your participants really do have understanding of their rights, which would likely generally be outside of the comprehension level of a child. So aside from translating services, this also means that sponsors must provide program materials in appropriate languages. A lot of times, a sponsor might say that they don't need to provide program materials in an alternate language because they've never received a request for such a thing. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have a need. It might mean that you're just not reaching a particular population and that they are not aware of your program at all, and that inadvertently a barrier has been created to accessing your program's benefits. So you want to make sure that as much as possible, that translated materials are made available in a way that meets the makeup of your community and your potential program participants, regardless of whether you've received specific requests for program materials in a different language or not. And you should note that a shortage of resources does not alleviate a sponsor of the responsibility to provide translated materials. So you may elect to share resources with other sponsors. You might train your bilingual staff to be interpreters, so you want to be aware of labor rules when you engage your staff to act as interpreters. You might also consider using language line services, or you might get support from local organizations throughout your community who can provide some assistance for you. Again, you just want to be aware of the confidentiality that we discussed in the previous slide. For those closed enrolled sites that are collecting meal benefit applications, there is a link here on the bottom of the slide to the USDA provided prototype materials that are translated in many different languages. So most of your meal benefit application translation needs should be met through this link. While the translated meal benefit applications specifically reference the school meals program, these applications would be appropriate for use in an SFSP setting if need be. For sponsors that operate only open sites, there may not be a large need for translated materials since there are not actual enrollment documents that are being provided to potential participants, but you still want to keep LEP individuals in mind when developing any kind of program communications or advertisements. To best leverage resources, RIDE provides promotional materials in English, Spanish, and Portuguese, but you may find the need for additional translations based on the makeup of your community, and that would be handled at the local level. Our last topic for this civil rights training is customer service. This may not seem like a civil rights topic, but as I mentioned earlier, many civil rights complaints actually arise from poor customer service. You want to make sure that your staff is not only well trained in the implementation of requirements of civil rights, including each of the areas that we've reviewed up to this point in terms of equal access and treatment, including lack of segregation in your seating areas, your serving lines, your service and facilities, assignment of your eating periods, and extension of meal benefits where applicable. And you need to make sure that your staff are trained on general customer service skills that may affect the way that a participant feels they have been treated from a civil rights standpoint. So you want to have your staff ask themselves, how would they want to be addressed? Are they treating each participant in the same manner and in the manner they would want to be treated? Has the participant been informed of exactly the information needed to make any kind of decision regarding program benefits? Have you given the person the opportunity to clarify and ask questions? And has the person been given all of the information necessary? This is important from a training standpoint, not only for those frontline staff being the staff that are actually distributing meals, but also for staff at the administrative level who have responsibilities for making meal benefit determinations, or hearing officials, your civil rights coordinator, etc. Many times, if a person feels like that feels that they are being treated in a way that is rude, or if they feel that their concerns and complaints are not being heard, whether the concerns are specifically about civil rights or not, that can snowball into a bigger issue that may result in a civil rights complaint. We've covered a lot of information today. Before we move on to summarize your civil rights responsibilities, I want to do a quick review of what discrimination may actually look like in the SFSP. Civil rights complaints may not always be as easy to identify as you would think. It's important that you understand what might constitute discrimination in the SFSP so that you can train your staff appropriately and hopefully avoid any civil rights violations. Some common scenarios might include things like offering leftover food only to the boys, refusing service to a child who identifies with a food allergy, consistently running out of food before all children present can be fed, and separating meal service lines or eating areas by gender or any other protected class. Always be mindful to ensure that your meal service isn't resulting in different treatment that is to the disadvantage of any participant, and if you do hear a complaint about one of these issues, be sure to take it seriously and follow the procedures that we have discussed today. Now that we've covered each of the required civil rights topics and some common scenarios that could be considered discriminatory in the SFSP, let's look at a summary to-do list that you should take away from this training. You need to make sure that you are offering your summer food service program in a non-discriminatory manner. You will need to train your staff annually on civil rights, including both the staff who are responsible for directly passing out the meals as well as your administrative staff. These trainings need to be documented, so you need to save both the dated training sign-in sheet and an agenda, and the agenda needs to specifically reference civil rights as a topic. Civil rights training for these staff members should include information specific to the SFSP. You need to develop and fully implement your civil rights complaint procedures, including specific steps for reporting complaints. You should develop and communicate a policy for requesting meal modifications. You need to make sure that your civil rights complaint forms, logs, and procedures are available to your staff. You need to prominently display the most current version of the And Justice for All poster in an area where your participants can easily read it. You need to use the full and current version of the USDA non-discrimination statement on all vital program materials and the shortened tag anywhere that it's been approved for use. And you need to offer meals to all participants present on site at the time of meal service. If you do all of the things listed on this slide, you should be on the right path for ensuring civil rights compliance and will likely avoid having to go down the road of dealing with a civil rights complaint. But at least if you do end up in the position for one reason or another, if you follow these steps, you'll have clear and well-communicated policies in place and procedures for how to handle any complaints that may arise. This concludes today's presentation on civil rights requirements in the SFSP. To access any templates or forms referenced during this training, please visit the RIDE Child Nutrition Program's website at the link found on the screen. If you have any questions related to this training or other SFSP's topics, please contact your RIDE program specialist or email our general child nutrition inbox at the email address found on the screen. Thank you.